Today at the National Press Club, Byron Fay, the Executive Director of Climate200, the crowdfunding initiative that provided financial support to independent candidates at the federal election. He's also a climate strategist and former Paris Agreement negotiator. Byron Fay with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club of Australia here in Canberra. My name is Tim Shaw and I'm a board member and director of the club. And delivering our Westpac address today is Byron Fay, the Executive Director and Campaign Director of Climate200, the community crowdfunding initiative with 11,200 donors from all 151 electorates across Australia. At the 2022 federal election, Climate200's donors levelled the playing field with pro-climate, pro-integrity and pro-gender equity community-backed independents, helping to elect 6 new independent MPs and 1 independent senator, and pushing another 3 seats marginal. A third of Australian voters chose independents and micro-parties over the major party candidates. Here at the Press Club, it's a practice to invite campaign directors to attend and to address the club. The Australian Labor Party has, and we have invited the other campaign directors. And we welcome Byron Fay today. He is a climate strategist, a former Paris Agreement negotiator, and a former advisor to Tim Storer, the independent senator from South Australia in the 45th Parliament. Byron also worked with a Biden-aligned political action committee during the 2020 US presidential election and is a proud descendant of the Dharug Nation, and we welcome those here on Ngunnawal and Ngambri lands here in Canberra. Now, you can join the conversation on Twitter at PressClubAUST, our hashtag NPC. Will you please warmly welcome Byron Fay.
Yama. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people, their elders past, present and emerging. I also acknowledge the Burraburrungal of the Dharug Nation, from whom I am a proud descendant. We have much to learn from our First Nations people, particularly when it comes to questions of sustainability and environmental stewardship. Real reconciliation lies in leaning into that knowledge and working with our First Nations people to find the solutions to the big challenges we face. The fact that we've seen year-on-year declines in trust in public government should concern us all. Just 25% of Australians believe the government can be trusted. That's 1 in 4. What if there was a different way? What if there was a way to change that? In 2019, I worked as a staffer for Tim Storer, the independent senator from South Australia. During the 18 months I worked in the Senate, there was only one time I saw the place operate in the way I believe those who created Australian democracy actually meant it to. It was during the only conscience vote that happened while I was there, one of only 43 that have taken place since 1950. Up to that point, the business of the Senate was conducted like many of us have sadly come to expect. Party positions dictated by a small group of individuals, with everyone else falling into line. The debates only served as an opportunity to deliver pre-rehearsed statements designed to exact maximum political damage. I remember asking myself at the time, what's the point of this? Why have this massive chamber where everyone can sit in it if you just have one representative from each party who can basically go into a room, small room, and decide on the matter? Question time was even worse, a fact that the gallery here doesn't need to be reminded of. But all that changed with that one conscience vote. Suddenly, each senator could make up their own minds, voting in the interests of their community and their own conscience. I couldn't believe the difference. The place came alive. Senators from across the political spectrum huddling in corridors, honestly exchanging views on the pros and cons of the legislation. Everyone in deep thought and contemplation, desperate to consult with key community stakeholders, Lo and behold, during the debate, other senators actually going into the chamber to hear what their peers had to say. In that moment, I got a glimpse of how our parliament would operate if we had a large crossbench of independents answerable to their communities alone. It would make a better, more respectful and respected politics. Cathy McGowan, the godmother of the community independence movement, often likes to start or end her talks with a Margaret Mead quote. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever has. On the 21st of May, small groups of thoughtful, committed citizens around this country changed Australia. A government that spent much of its time fighting against climate action, greater integrity, transparency, gender equity, was thrown out. On that day, 18 women were added to the parliament, making it the most gender diverse in Australia's history. 7 new climate-ambitious community independents were also elected, joining the 4 that were already there, making it the biggest federal crossbench we've ever seen. Around the country, at least 20,000 people volunteered for community independence in the lead up to the last election. Many of them were engaging in politics for the very first time, making it one of the most significant democratic revivals in recent memory. These were real people having real conversations in an effort to achieve real democracy. Today, I'm going to tell the story of that extraordinary result and the contribution Climate200 made to it. But before I do, I want to be crystal clear. Climate200 was just one cog in a very large wheel that helped the community independence movement achieve what it did. Climate200 did not start the movement. We did not start the campaigns. We simply worked to level the playing field for existing grassroots community efforts and the genuine community leaders they selected. History told us how hard it was for community independence to succeed against the party machines. Unsurprisingly, the victors write the rules, and the major parties have rigged the game in their favour. Taxpayer-funded communications budgets, access to the names and addresses of every voter, multi-million-dollar government-funded advertising campaigns. And that's just a start. Communities around the country that wanted a different type of political representation and leadership on the big issues facing our country and our planet needed our help. So we at Climate200 sought out to provide it. So, how did we get here? Well, let me start by contrasting the mood of this election with 2019. You know the one, Shorten v Morrison, Shorten ahead in the polls, on track for certain victory. What was election night like for you in 2019? If you're a political junkie, you might have been at home with the ABC on one TV, Sky on the other, furiously tabbing through the AEC and Poll Bludger websites on your laptop, or while refreshing your Twitter feed and silencing the room anytime Anthony Green spoke. My experience that year was quite different. Work had taken me to Botswana, where I was helping Indigenous communities apply the experience of our First Nations people in reintroducing traditional fire management practices to reduce emissions. So, there I was, in the middle of the baking Kalahari desert, sat atop a 4-wheel drive, looking out for lions with one eye, trying to glean the election results over patchy internet signal with the other. Despair set in as the climate election we'd been promised again failed to materialise. As I looked out from on top of that car, the drought-ridden environment around me was a reminder that the urgency of the climate crisis is upon us. Earlier that week, we had seen a bloat of hippos huddled together in the last muddy pool of water left after a rainy season hadn't arrived. The outlook for the animals, as for us, was grim. We could ill afford another 3 years of government inaction or worse. But in all that gloom, there were 2 very clear silver linings. First, Zali Steggall won the seat of Warringah, proving that when a community takes a stand against climate inaction and backs an incredible local candidate, together they can topple a former Prime Minister in the safest of inner-city seats. Second, Helen Haines was elected as the Independent of Indi following Cathy McGowan's retirement. For the first time in Australian history, a federal seat was successfully passed from one community independent to another. These victories built on the foundations laid by independents who had come before them, like Andrew Wilkie, Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott and Karen Phelps. After 2019, several communities realised the significance of what these independents had achieved, and they set out to try and replicate their success. Veterans from the Indi and Warringah campaigns, including McGowan, Alana Johnson, Jill Briggs, Kirsty Gold and Tina Jackson, mentored a number of communities and helped them find their feet. Some adopted the Voices Of model pioneered in Indi. Others were more energised by what they didn't want, choosing instead to establish their own versions of Vote Tony Out, which had made a strong contribution to Abbott's demise in Warringah. In Sydney, the Zali-Stego halo effect was becoming apparent, with strong teams emerging in Sydney, Wentworth and Mackellar. "We just want our own Zali," was a common retort. In February 2021, McGowan held her inaugural National Convention for Community Independence, getting elected. She expected 50 people to attend. She ended up with 300 from 81 electorates. The enthusiasm, excitement and energy, even over Zoom, were palpable. It was clear that something exhilarating and quite incredible was happening at the community level. And it was interesting for us because climate action and integrity seemed to be some of the most consistent motivators for those involved. On climate, the Black Summer bushfires had taken their toll, as had the federal government's weak response. Cocktails in Hawaii, anyone? On integrity, people had enough of the endless rorts and blatant pork barrelling and were ready to take matters into their own hands. Real people were ready to have real conversations in a bid for real democracy. Following the convention, people gathered around kitchen tables across the country and began the process of unearthing authentic, intelligent and passionate local leaders they could put forward as their candidates. Ultimately, these campaigns mobilised volunteers at a scale rarely seen before. 2,000 volunteers in the Victorian seat of Kooyong alone. Together, community volunteers directly engaged 250,000 households. They hand out flyers at supermarkets and train stations. They knocked on 166,000 doors and gave up their evenings to make 63,000 phone calls to voters. They braved the cold at polling booths, and in many electorates, the seas of teal, sky blue, pink and purple on the day were formidable. And these people loved it. For most, it was their first time engaging in politics. Nick from Bondi talked about having made more friends in the community volunteering for Allegra Spender than they had in the 16 years they'd been living in the area before. Greg from the Northern Beaches of Sydney spoke about how volunteering for Dr. Sophie Scomps gave his life real purpose and motivated him to give thousands of hours of his time. People say Australians are disengaged with politics. These results were evidence to the contrary. People are actually highly engaged. They've just been turned off by the party machines, the factions, the toxic negativity, and they've never felt like they've had someone to support who truly represents them. Many factors led to the success of the community independence movement this election, too many to cover here today. But what I will do is outline the three capabilities that Climate200 deployed to contribute to this incredible result. The first was fundraising. The major parties are fundraising Goliaths. It's one of the main reasons they've maintained such a stranglehold on Australian democracy for so long. In 2019 alone, the ALP raised $126 million, and the LNP $181 million. That is a hell of a lot of Bunnings sausage sizzles. But of course, that's not how they do it. They prefer $10,000 a head dinners with the Prime Minister. The reality is that money is a critical ingredient for running a successful political campaign at the federal level. The main reason candidates need money is to ensure voters actually know who they are. And I know it sounds simple, but it's true. There are around 100,000 voters in each electorate. So even with strong networks of supporters, communicating their message to enough people without advertising is almost impossible. The campaigns knew that, and they were working hard to raise money for their own communities. We were clear that we were never going to be the sole funder to any campaign. Indeed, we decided to start by limiting our donations to matching what had already been raised locally by the campaigns themselves. The fundraising theory was the same as for 2019 when Climate200 had a successful test run. The fundamental reason we weren't seeing progress on the community priorities like climate and integrity and gender equity was not due to a lack of good ideas or good advocacy. We had some of the best minds in the country doing that work. The problem was the decision maker that advocacy was being presented to was the wrong person. Climate200 with Simon Holmes à Court, he had hypothesised that striking at the root of the problem would require replacing those people. And so, Climate200 was his attempt to leverage philanthropy into politics. The 200 was meant to represent 200 donors, so when we started working to bring the organisation out of hibernation in 2021, one question we had to ask ourselves was, should we change the name? Could we find 200 people willing to contribute? It seemed like a lot, especially when we had 27 who contributed to the 2019 effort. We felt that people were turned off by politics and were generally cautious about sticking their necks out. To complicate matters further, not a single candidate had yet been nominated by their communities. Fortunately, we had good examples of the types of candidates who we hoped would emerge in the likes of Zali Steggall, Helen Haynes, Rebecca Sharkey, Andrew Wilkie and Karen Phelps. But would that be enough? None of us could come up with a better name, so we decided to charge on and see how we went. We started banging the can in mid-2021. Safe to say, it went better than we expected. By October, we'd raised $2 million from over 2,000 donors. Gone was the anxiety about being able to find the 200. Key to our success was a series of matching challenges where larger donors only agreed to donate a certain sum if the public matched their pledge dollar for dollar. The large donors loved it because they could see their contributions bringing others in. The smaller donors loved it because they could see their donations being doubled. It was a win-win. By election day, using this technique, we had raised $13 million from 11,200 donors. Now, the question was whether we rebrand as Climate 11,200, but it doesn't exactly have the same ring to it. Our donors came from all walks of life. They included entrepreneurs, farmers, tradespeople, teachers, pensioners, healthcare workers. 1/3 of our donors were from rural and regional Australia. Collectively, they hail from every single electorate in the country. All of them hope for a better future for the planet and a more civilised politics. Wendy Challoner was one. The former primary school teacher grew up in the wheat belt of WA and had voted for the National and Liberal parties her whole life. But now she was fed up with the LNP dragging its feet on climate and wanted to do something about it. After the election, the most consistent feedback we got from donors was best money I've ever spent. Thanks to their support, we were able to donate to 23 values-aligned community independents. And what an incredible cohort of true community leaders they were. The quality of the candidates was a huge factor in the success of these campaigns. None of them put their hand up because they wanted a promotion or to be Prime Minister. They didn't have to do this to be successful. They were already successful. They stood because they were fed up with decades of inaction on the things the community cared about. I won't name them all, but there are a few I'd like to single out today. The first to be selected and announced was Kylie Tink in North Sydney, a Liberal voting former charity executive and a formidable advocate with a track record of delivering the seemingly impossible. As the CEO of the McGrath Foundation, she played a central role in establishing the pink test match. Any woman who could convince a bunch of the blokiest blokes on Channel 9 Sport to turn a test match pink was a force to be reckoned with. Next came Allegra Spender, a management consultant, corporate executive and daughter of a former Liberal MP and the iconic fashion designer Carla Zampatti. As the chair of the Sydney Renewable Energy Power Company, she had first-hand experience with the economic opportunities that decarbonisation presents. For someone of that calibre and Liberal Party pedigree, to be stepping up as a community independent for Wentworth was saying something. These were people who in a different era would have joined the Liberal Party. As I would hear Kylie Tink say many times during the election campaign, she didn't feel like she had left the Liberal Party. The Liberal Party had clearly left her. Next came Zoe Daniel in Goldstein, the journalist and former foreign correspondent who reported from war zones and covered some of the world's most significant events. Her cut-through ability was phenomenal, as her launch video, which received over 300,000 organic views, testified. After that, the floodgates opened. In Mackellar, on Sydney's northern beaches, where I grew up, they selected Dr. Sophie Scomps, a local GP, community organiser and Olympic qualifying athlete. The community in Kooyong selected Dr. Monique Ryan, the head of neurology at the Melbourne Children's Hospital. In WA, Kate Cheney, another former management consultant and business strategist, was put forward. And in the ACT, the community nominated David Pocock, the former captain of the Australian rugby team, a long-time conservationist and community leader. He was to take on an altogether different challenge, contesting one of just 2 ACT Senate seats. True community leaders of incredible quality. The second key capability that Climate200 deployed was sophisticated and high-quality content. One thing we realised very early on was that if voters were educated about who the candidates were and what they stood for, they wanted to vote for them. So we set out to do our bit to bring these outstanding community leaders to voters' attention. Our talented team of creators made 16 podcast episodes, 87 videos, 1,300 social media ads to supplement the efforts of these incredible campaigns. The messages and stories we produced amplified the voices of the candidates, their volunteers, their voters, and social media influencers. And it's that last cohort, social media influencers, that proved decisive in engaging a hard-to-reach but critical voter segment, young people. 2022 was the first election where millennial and Gen Z voters outnumbered baby boomers. The It Takes Three social media campaign harnessed youth-focused cultural influences as trusted messengers to spread a Vote Independent for Climate message. The campaign was promoted by a series of high-profile Australians, including the band Lime Cordiale, who created a hilarious launch video. In the end, the campaign reached an audience of 2 million people. I want to acknowledge every creator and cultural influencer who got behind these candidates. Your efforts were decisive in spreading the message beyond the press pack into the news feeds and timelines of young Australians. A third key capability that Climate200 provided was analytics. We wanted to be data-driven in our decision-making, so a robust polling program was always going to be central. It would give us the confidence to make hard decisions and offer the campaigns the information they needed to run effective and efficient races. We consulted a US-based polling expert on the design of the program and engaged Redbridge and community engagement to roll it out. By July 2021, we had scraped together enough money to do our first round of polling. We picked 3 electorates to start with where we knew strong community campaigns were building: Mackellar, North Sydney and Wentworth. From what we'd heard, Zali Steggall's brand was strong in those seats, so instead of just asking about a generic independent, we asked specifically about how people would vote if the independent was a candidate like Zali Steggall. The results blew us away. In North Sydney, the vote for a generic independent was 16%, but that vote shot up to 28% when it was an independent like Zali Steggall, which could put a candidate like that into a winning position. The other electorates had similar results, but as one sceptical donor said to me at the time, "Zali Steggalls don't grow on trees, mate. She's a bloody barrister and 4-time Olympian." It was a fair point, but we knew there were amazing people in all of these seats. The community just needed to find them. Another thing we learned was that climate change was a major issue for voters. It was the most important for voters in North Sydney and Wentworth, and it was the second most important for voters in Mackellar. When we did our next round of polling in Goldstein and Kooyong in Victoria, this time using Helen Haynes as the reference point, the results were even more compelling. We continued the program, cycling through electorates where the community was most active and the underlying fundamentals were the strongest. By December, Most of the candidates had been announced by their communities and their campaigns were in full swing. Their primary numbers were creeping up from low bases of around 10%. But by March, we were starting to get worried. Most of the candidates' primaries still sat in the mid-teens, and they would be very unlikely to win from there. But when the election was called in April, all of that completely changed. Suddenly, people woke up to the fact they were going to be going to the ballot box in a few weeks and started paying closer attention to their options. The candidates' commitments to do better on a raft of issues, including climate change and integrity, were resonating strongly with voters. And the extensive grassroots community organising efforts were also yielding fruit. The independent primaries across the board went through the roof. But it wasn't just their policy platforms that voters were responding to. It was also the way they were running their campaigns. Relentlessly positive, inclusive, volunteer-driven, grassroots community efforts. This was summed up for me by Kate Chaney's encounter with two young girls in the days after the election. The girls had asked their mother to drive them to Chaney's campaign office in search of a poster. Chaney, of course, obliged and asked why they wanted a poster given the election was over. Their response: "You were the only one who wasn't mean to the others." By the time we did our last round of polling in mid-May, we were relatively confident that if the trend we had seen emerge over the previous months held, and that was a big if, then 7 of the candidates we supported would likely win. The fact that climate change and integrity were consistently remaining in the top 3 issues in those seats gave us further confidence. And so it was. Chaney, Daniel, Ryan, Scomps, Spender, Tink and Pocock all won. And it wasn't just those 7 that made strong progress. Huge inroads were achieved by other pro-climate community candidates that we supported, like Nicolette Buller in Bradfield on Sydney's North Shore. And it wasn't just a city phenomenon either. In the National Party seat of Cowper on the New South Wales North Coast, Kaz Heiss took it to within 2.3%. In the rural seats of Calare in New South Wales and Wannon in Victoria, Kate Hook and Alex Dyson made it to the final 2, delivering massive blows to the National and Liberal Party primaries in the country. So, rigorous data, persuasive content and generous donors were the 3 key contributions Climate200 brought to the community independence movement. It would be remiss of me to leave this stage without thanking some of the people who enabled us to make this contribution. First, to our 11,200 donors, thank you for believing in our mission and trusting us to deploy your contributions for maximum impact. None of this would have happened, none of our contribution would have been possible without your generous support. To our wise and experienced advisory council of John Hewson, Meg Lees, Barry Jones, Karen Phelps, Tony Windsor, Rob Oakeshott, Kira Peacock, Anna Josephson and Damien Hodgkinson. You gave us the confidence to put our heads above the parapet and establish clarity of vision and purpose amongst the noise of an election campaign. To our entrepreneurial and resilient and incredibly hard-working staff, thank you for believing in this project, for leaving secure jobs to help us build a plane while we were flying it, and for delivering the seemingly impossible day in, day out. Special shout out to our management team, Susie Bays, Nina O'Connor, Claire Snyder, Alex Rantino and Mike Clay. And to our convener, Simon, for having the wisdom to dream this project into existence, the confidence in the team to deliver, and the grit and resilience and temperament to weather the storms with humility and grace. The major parties learned some tough lessons this election. No longer can they consider a seat safe or take it for granted. No longer can MPs just vote as their party tells them to, without thought to what their communities actually want. The 2-party system has been turned on its head. No longer can we assume the main choice for voters will be between the ALP and LNP. This election, nearly 1/3 of us didn't vote for the major parties. In 1951, it was just 2% of voters that did so. The party strangleholds on Australian politics have been shattered. A well-organised community with the right support can take on the party machines and win even against former and would-be future Prime Ministers. The result was a launch pad for the community independence movement, not a landing zone. Now, the real work begins. The uncomfortable truth is that the world is still on track for catastrophic levels of warming. Climate200's vision is for every government in Australia to adopt a science-based response to the climate crisis. And we're still miles away from that. Neither major party's 2030 targets are consistent with keeping warming to safe levels. The LNP's target is consistent with 3 degrees and the ALP's with 2. Even at 2 degrees, the Great Barrier Reef will be gone. An irreplaceable asset that supports more livelihoods than the coal industry in Australia. 64,000 jobs, a $6.4 billion benefit to the economy, all gone. That's just the start. As the University of Melbourne research found recently, 2 degrees would cost the Australian economy close to $600 billion by 2030 and nearly $800 billion by 2050. The recent floods in northwest Sydney are just the latest reminder of what is becoming increasingly regular signs that the climate crisis is not going away. And as the insufficiency of our government's efforts to address the problem become clearer, the calls to take stronger action will grow louder. Fortunately, tackling the climate crisis comes with an unparalleled economic opportunity for our country. We are perfectly positioned to reap the benefits, both financial and environmental, as the world races to decarbonise. We've lost a decade to inaction. We can't afford to lose another. An enduring crossbench of centrist, pro-climate independents can equip our parliament with the will and vision it needs to tackle the difficult issues we face. And voters desperately want a new way of doing politics. The way forward is clear. Since the election, there has been a paradigm shift in our parliament. We are moving towards a system where conflict and chaos will be replaced with community, compromise and conversation as the foundations of governing. My message to Australians is simple. Lean in. If you're watching this at home, wondering if you should get involved or you should start your own community independence movement or group, then the answer is yes. It will be one of the most satisfying things you ever do. This is a movement for first-timers, first-time donors, candidates, door knockers, letterbox droppers. It's a movement of professional beginners. For too long, Australian politics has been the domain of political staffers, faceless men, factional warlords who rely on people being disengaged with politics. Change is beckoning. Australians want real people, real conversations and real democracy. Winning an election is obviously hard work, but the key is people power. To sustain and grow this movement, it needs more. More great candidates from a diversity of backgrounds. More campaigners and volunteers. Climate200 needs more donors. We need more gutsy, courageous people to continue streaming in from all walks of life. This is just the beginning. The movement belongs to every Australian, people just like you. To paraphrase Margaret Mead's quote from the start of this speech, never doubt that small groups of thoughtful, committed volunteers, community leaders and donors can change Australian politics. Indeed, it is the only thing that ever will. And they're just getting started. Thank you.
Byron, it appears that certainly in political speak, teal is the new black. And right around Australia, I think teal is sold out. The working press are very keen to ask questions of you today, and thank you very much for that speech. And my colleagues will give us their name and their organisation when they come up. But I just want to draw you to the points you made about donors. And certainly that the donors really came to the message of Climate200. You've told us about Climate200. Let me just quote you what someone else thinks of Climate200. By the looks of things, Climate200 is simply a large group of wealthy trust fund babies that are the new bunyip aristocracy, that are essentially providing themselves the equivalent of colonial titles with hereditary privileges in order to subvert democracy. That was from Victorian Senator Jane Hume on the Credlin program on Sky News. You've spoken about donors today, and I want to ask you particularly about Mike Cannon-Brookes. In the days and weeks prior to the May 2022 election, did Mr Cannon-Brookes make a substantial donation to Climate200? Was it directed to a particular seat? And if so, was it to match dollar for dollar those donations that you spoke of from those other 11,200 donors?
I'm glad you've asked the question about our donors, because we are incredibly proud of the diversity in the group of people who contributed to this project. As we discussed in the speech, all 151 electorates around the country represented. A third of our donors from rural and regional areas and from all walks of life. And indeed, when that statement was made, we saw a flood of tweets come in responding to Senator Hume, who were our donors, talking about their backgrounds, and teachers, pensioners, farmers, social workers, incredibly diverse group of people. Again, 11,200 from around the country. In terms of who contributed, we are scrupulous in our compliance with the Australian Electoral Commission requirements to disclose donors above the $14,500 disclosure threshold, and the AEC has very clear timelines around that, and so we will be complying with those timelines as the year unfolds.
Well, Mr Cannon-Brookes is not a trust fund baby. He's an Australian entrepreneur and a great success story. Would you like to use this platform today to tell us Mike Cannon-Brookes' donation, and was it directed to a particular electorate?
We'll comply with our requirements under the AEC requirement.
I'm sure my colleagues will follow up on that question. And our first question is from Pablo Vinales.
Thank you. Pablo Vinales from SBS. You touched on the ALP's 2030 emissions reduction target, citing the science that you say it's not good enough. But given the fact that Labor now has a mandate, the Teals obviously had much more ambitious targets. I'm curious to get your thoughts on the perfect being the enemy of the good here. Do you think it is incumbent on the Greens in particular, like David Pocock has signalled, to get behind Labor's policy?
The first thing to say about the 45% that the government has taken and enshrined in our nationally determined contribution is that it's a step in the right direction. Really encouragingly, they've said it's a floor, not a ceiling. And of course, there's always room as we move through the decade, as the science, the economics, the technology become more apparent, to hopefully increase that. So we would hopefully see that as a stepping stone to greater ambition. In terms of what the now elected members of Parliament and Senator want to do, that's entirely up to them. They obviously had very strong views on the type of ambition that the country should have. They took to their communities during the election cycle. But it's entirely up to them as to how they prosecute that in their time up at Parliament, and we have every faith they're going to do a great job of doing that.
But would it not be a step backward if we saw this blocked in the Senate after, a decade of climate wars?
I think a lot of people around Australia want to see progress. They want to see us stepping forward. The fact that this target is an increase to what the previous government had, I think is a very encouraging sign. The fact it's a floor, not a ceiling, is very encouraging. And I think the community in the broad wants to see some sort of parliamentary action on this issue, and I think they'll be very encouraging of that.
Our next question is from Georgie Moore.
Thank you for your address, Georgie Moore from AFR. You said the election was a launching pad for independence. Now, the New South Wales and Victorian governments are different from the former coalition on climate. So my question is, to what extent does Climate200 consider it might be able to pull off a bit of a repeat, albeit on a smaller scale, when Victoria goes to the polls in November and New South Wales in March? And also on New South Wales, Climate200 candidates campaigned heavily on integrity at a federal level. Now there's an ICAC in New South Wales, but how much ammo do you see things like the John Barilaro trade post saga giving independents in a state election rerun?
The first thing to note is that our model is very much demand-driven, right? So this all starts with the community itself. So if the community mobilises, if the community judges their elected representatives to not be performing in the way that they would like them to, not be showing the leadership they would like them to, and particularly when it comes to our support on questions of climate integrity and gender equity, and they start to mobilise, and that's the key threshold point, right? If that doesn't happen, we as Climate200, we don't start campaigns, we don't pick candidates, so it's all down to where the community mobilises. In terms of the state races, it's the same thing, right? If people there start to get mobilised, start to speak to their friends and colleagues and start to get together and decide to have a different type of community leadership, then that's a discussion we will be willing to have. But that's a hypothetical right now. There is some momentum, particularly building in Victoria, but it's a long way away from being the type of campaign that we would be supporting at this point in time.
Do you think it's likely that that mobilisation is picking up in Victoria and New South Wales? How likely, obviously you'd workshop and strategise these things, how likely do you see that being?
There's definitely momentum. Like across the country, people have seen this result at the federal level and are inspired to get involved in the community independence movement, particularly if they're concerned about climate integrity. They've seen the ability to elect leaders, community leaders who prioritise these issues. So wouldn't be surprised if we see communities motivating themselves down there. In terms of your question on the federal ICAC, obviously integrity was front and centre to what we wanted to see, and it's really encouraging to see so many new faces in Parliament who are going to pick up the integrity banner. Helen Haynes obviously has been a standard bearer of that in previous parliaments, and we look forward to seeing a National Anti-Corruption Commission delivered this term.
Thank you.
Just following up on what Georgie was talking about, was there a degree of relief when you noted that the ALP were able to form a majority government? Because at one point, the Teal independents were potentially that balance of power. And in that regard, do you see the proactivity of these successful members of Parliament now in enforcing the legislation, writing that legislation, or do you see them as being comparative to what the government and other interests are going to be saying in the House?
Indeed, we've got a great track record from past parliaments of seeing how independents, even if they aren't in a balance of power, can make a huge contribution. The only piece of climate legislation introduced to the last parliament was introduced by Zali Steggall, an independent. Same with the National Integrity Commission. So plenty of examples of how independents can provide great thought leadership from wherever they are in Parliament, and that's exactly what their communities expect of them, to show leadership on these issues that they care about and to be putting forward proposals to the government that hopefully they will adopt one day.
Our next question is from Jess Malcolm.
Thank you for your speech. You mentioned that Kylie Tink said during the campaign that she didn't feel like she had left the Liberal Party, but the Liberal Party had left her. So what direction would you think the Liberal Party would have to take for Climate200 to be concerned about losing these Teal seats back to the coalition at the next election?
Well, the LNP got a very strong message from these communities at the election, right? They wanted to see ambitious leadership on climate, on integrity and gender equity, and the Liberal national parties were not clearly providing that. So if they want to have any hope of reclaiming these seats, then the reality is they will have to put to the community much stronger positions on the things the communities care about. And let's not forget, it's the communities themselves that decided to bring in a new type of representation in these seats. If they want to go off, if the Liberal Party and National Party want to go off to the fringes, to the extreme, they don't want to come back to the sensible centre, which is where people are on climate and integrity. The majority of Australians think we need to take action on these things. Then I'm sure the Liberal and National parties will struggle to reclaim these seats.
So it's just climate and integrity? Or what specifically outside of those topics would you think that they've lost?
I think there are a range of issues. If you look at any of the campaigns that were run, there were a raft of local issues as well. Some had healthcare as a major priority. In terms of the issues that Climate200 was focused on, it was climate and integrity, and indeed in our polling we saw those were always in the top 2 or 3.
Great, thank you.
Just on that and the expansion of issues of climate, issues of health, the strength of the economy, there are some particular electorate issues that are relevant there. But can I just quote Di Lee? She told the ABC that she is a real independent. She's not a Teal one. My electorate here has a different need to other electorates, and that the Teals are representing those other electorates. there would be other issues that we will have some conversation over. Are you going to encourage those Teal independents to reach out to the dialees in the Parliament? And what role would Climate200 have in assisting dialee to better understand the opportunities?
I think dialee's success is another reminder that this is a broad community movement. So the community independence movement has many faces, and great to see other community independents joining the ranks of Parliament. I'm sure they're going to be talking together. Independents often like to engage with each other on these matters, but that's entirely a matter for them, and Climate200 doesn't have any role to play in the day-to-day functioning of how they conduct themselves in Parliament.
Our next question is from Dana Morse.
Dana Morse from the ABC. Thank you for your address. I think it's fair to say to some extent Climate200 candidates did catch the major parties unawares at this election. Looking forward to the next one, how do you propose to maintain the momentum, and do you actually have the firepower to survive a sustained attack from the major parties now that they know exactly what they're up against?
I'll just correct you on one point. Certainly weren't Climate200's candidates. These were the community candidates, and Climate200 was one of many contributors to the campaigns as a donor. In terms of what's to come next, well, it's anyone's guess. It's in the hands of the community, but you can see people are fired up. All the community members, the volunteers who got involved in these campaigns really loved the experience. For them, it was some of the high points of their lives. And so I think we're going to see going forward that enthusiasm, momentum and energy spreading out further. But of course, it also comes down to the community's view on the representation that they've currently got. If they're dissatisfied with the leadership that's being shown from their elected representatives, then of course the community will be motivated. But if they think they're doing the right thing, then it would be very hard to see a community movement building.
So take your campaign directorship hat off and put your executive director hat on of Climate200. Why aren't you talking to your donors about the establishment of an independence centre here in Canberra, where those independents, whether it be dialee or those Teal independents, can get the resources that, according to them, they're not going to get from the federal government in terms of staffing? Is that an issue that your advisory board has discussed? And what have you decided to do in terms of additional resources to the elected Teal independents?
Climate200 isn't a think tank. We are designed to support community campaigns, to support true community leaders that have been nominated by their communities to get elected. That's our function. To be clear on the staffing question, not a single independent MP that we supported has asked us for support to help them fund their staffing, and frankly, it's not actually our mandate. It's not what we do. We are focused very clearly on supporting community campaigns when they arise, and we hope to be doing that as we go forward.
Our next question, Simon Gross.
Simon Gross, Canberra IQ. My question's about carbon offsets. Interested in how purist/pragmatic your people may be. We had, late last year, we had some ANU climate technocrats here, and they estimated that to achieve net zero by 2050, Australia would need at least 100 million tonnes worth of carbon offsets to achieve net zero, which is at least 20% of our current emissions. Is that an acceptable level as far as you're concerned?
Firstly, just going to have to correct you again, certainly not our people, the community's candidates. When it comes to questions of offsets, I think as some of the independents have pointed out, how we get to our targets is also very important. There have obviously been some issues raised with the offset system here in Australia. I understand there's some great work that's going to be going on to look into that in more detail and see if there's any tweaks that are needed to it. But I do think there's incredible opportunity around reducing emissions in Australia. Of course, in our land sector, and I talked about the Savannah Fire Management emissions offset projects in my speech that I have worked on previously. Also in the drawdown space, the emissions permanent sequestration space, I think there's a lot of good opportunity there too. But as I say, we're not a policy think tank, and so these discussions are much better had by the people who are going to be making the policy up in Parliament.
Our next question, Dan Jarvis-Sparty.
Thanks for your speech, Byron. Just, I guess, following up from Dana's question, you mentioned in your speech that the party stranglehold had been shattered, but what makes you believe that what we saw on May 21 wasn't just a flash in the pan, that casting forward 3 years' time, there won't be that same level of discontent in the community against the government? Labor, potentially would have acted on climate, would have acted on integrity, would have acted on gender equality. How do you respond to that argument that this was a flash in the pan?
Well, of course, it's up to the communities themselves to figure that out. But what we can see is that there is a lot of fans out there for the independents that were in the last parliament, and indeed that's why we think some of these communities were so successful, particularly around Sydney. And we talked a bit about how in our polling we would use, before there was a candidate, an example of the type of independent that we thought could be successful there. And Zali Steggall, lots of fans of Zali Steggall in North Sydney, Wentworth, in Bradfield, in Mackellar. As these other independents have come into Parliament, they're going to be incredible local leaders. They're going to be giving that sort of degree of community engagement that they would very unlikely have had before in those communities, and we wouldn't be surprised if, building on that inspiration, that other communities say, hey, I want my own. I want my own Sophie Scomps, I want my own Kylie Tink, I want my own David Pocock. And so I wouldn't be surprised if we see this movement grow as we go forward.
So just a quick follow-up. Do you think there has been a permanent shift in our politics, or is there a possibility that we just eventually over time regress back to what things were like 10, 20 years ago?
I think the fact that the major party primaries are at all-time lows is really saying something. A third of voters chose not to give their votes to the major parties. That has been a systemic year-on-year decline in general. It's pretty clear the trajectory there. Voters are looking for a different way of doing politics, a different type of political representation. And as the profile of these amazing community leaders grows, I think we're going to see more people running at that.
Our next question, Jane Norman.
Hello, Jane Norman from the ABC. Thank you for your address today. And to follow up on Dan's question, in 3 short years, given the extraordinary success that Climate200 had, as well as the independents at this election, will you commit to bankrolling the campaigns of the 6 new independents who have been elected, plus the 4 who were re-elected, who were assisted with Climate200 funding? And if in 3 years the big issues like climate, like integrity, have in political speak been sort of neutralised because they've been addressed, how does Climate200, reimagine itself or reshape its agenda to then fight another election?
In 2019, after the election, Climate200 did go into hibernation for a period. We've decided this time around, given what's happened, that will not be the case. But of course, what we do going forward is entirely up to our donors, our supporters. And so if going forward, that incredible donor community is keen to continue supporting the work that we're doing, which is going in and supporting these incredible community leaders and the campaigns around them, then we could well make a strong contribution. But as we said to our donors throughout the election campaign, we worked very hard to go broke every week. As our accountant told us, it was a very bad business strategy. Nevertheless, we made sure we did it because we wanted to ensure that all the money we were getting from our donors was going to where it was needed. If we're looking forward to the next federal election, no, we don't have money to do that. We don't have money to commit to bankrolling any campaigns, but we hope next time around the donor community will see what's been achieved and be keen to go on the journey with us again.
Thanks.
One electorate won by Teal, $1.4 million was spent in that electorate. Are you concerned about calls for the cap on electoral spending per candidate? What are your views? What is Climate200's views on that?
One thing that's very clear to us is any sort of discussion around spending caps needs to be in the context of a root and branch review of all the incumbency benefits that the major parties have given themselves. And we talked about some of these in the speech. $750,000 each election cycle that they have to communicate to their communities, which are often just used for campaigning. We know about the pork barrelling that governments undertake to try and win votes in their electorates. And there's plenty of others that are in that vein. And so very open-minded to the idea of caps, but it has to be done as part of a root and branch review. And it has to ensure we are not disadvantaging future community groups that want to put up community leaders in a way that it stops them from doing that. And I think we should think very carefully about any sort of reform in that space so it doesn't simply entrench the advantages the major parties have given themselves.
From the Canberra Times, Nick Stewart.
You made the point that Zali Steggall, people felt uncertain about voting for an independent, but when it was an independent like Zali Steggall, they felt, yeah, she's got the tick of approval. We'll vote for her. And the Climate200 brand, despite the questions over the number 200, is nevertheless really significant. Here in the ACT, you got a Climate200 incredibly senator up. Although you were actually supporting two people because you supported both two Senate candidates. David Pocock was the one who actually succeeded. To what extent does this now become a brand that you are going to continue on with? And to what extent is this going to change politics in Australia?
We're very excited about the contribution we were able to provide. And again, if the donor community that supported us wants to do so going forward, then we think we can scale up our efforts. For us, it's as simple as that, really. If the community backs us, then we can do more work. And that'll depend on a bunch of factors, where the community itself is mobilised, the performance of the government. But it was, we were really satisfied with the results. Seeing 7 community independent candidates that we supported get elected, but really the victory for those candidates lies with the efforts of the communities themselves. They were the ones that mobilised, they did the hard work, they did the heavy lifting. We were just one of many contributors to those community endeavours.
Steve Lewis.
Thank you, Tim. Byron, congratulations on your campaign. It used to be the maxim in Australian politics that the major parties would get around 90% of the primary vote. As you've said, it collapsed to about 67. Labor Party with, I think, 32.7 formed government. You talk about momentum, you talk about beginnings, you talk about energy. So what's the end goal? Do you envisage, say, within 2 to 3 electoral cycles, community independence, forming government, starting to actually work with major parties to form government, as we've seen in the ACT with the Greens and the Labor Party? Or can you envisage in your time, in your lifetime, where we get an Antipodes and Emmanuel Macron, somebody, an independent who actually becomes Prime Minister? Is that the end goal, and do you think it's achievable, given the extraordinary result we saw just a couple of months ago?
Where this movement goes is entirely up to the community. So the Australian people will determine the skies it reaches. Obviously, we've seen that communities around the country have been very eager to embrace this new form of political representation. They loved it. And the community leaders they've got are going to be incredible MPs and an incredible senator up in Parliament. And so we would not be surprised if this is a launch pad, not a landing zone for the movement. And you've got amazing people out there like Cathy McGowan and her Community Independence Project that are spreading the good word around the country, and hopefully they will continue to do that sort of thing. And it would not surprise us at all if other communities seek to build on the success that has been laid down this election and seek to embrace their own...
So could we see an independent Prime Minister in Australia, say, in the next several cycles?
It's entirely up to the community. If the community leans into this movement in a forceful way across the country, then the sky's the limit.
What a great television drama theme.
It's not bad, Tim.
Not so Secret City.
No.
Thank you, Steve. Our next question, Georgie Moore.
You said that from your perspective there is some encouraging momentum at state levels, looking at state elections for independent candidates and support for them. Assuming this is the case and this momentum grows, how would Climate200 change the way it raises and distributes money so state election funding caps don't, from your perspective, hobble your bid to have another successful outcome in Victoria, New South Wales or something?
Yeah, obviously the context at the state level is very different. There are caps. We're still working through the type of contribution we may be able to make in that context. Obviously, we've got 11,200 donors who've contributed to our project. We could be in a world in which we suggest to them to make direct donations to different campaigns. That's the sort of thing we could be doing in the future. But again, entirely down to the donor communities, whether they're interested in those campaigns and down to whether those campaigns actually emerge, and all that's yet to be seen.
Thank you.
Briefly, how do you manage the expectation, those community donors and those community voices that rose to create these candidates? You know, Jacinda Ardern said in Sydney last week, when answering a question about high expectations for her government when she was elected, she wanted to turn that to hope and aspiration. What do you hope for your elected members, that they can deliver on their promise to the Parliament to be the independents that they said there would be, or that their priority is truly to their community?
Well, I think that's what's really exciting. We've seen the track record of independents when they get in. They generally stay in. So the communities love it. They like the type of representation they get from community independents. They love how accessible they are. They love how many community events they tend to do. They love that they think dynamically about the way to engage their community. And so it wouldn't surprise us at all if, based off this next cohort, you see a much more satisfied suite of electorates with their representation, and that those independents are there for a very long time.
Would you like to be an independent candidate, say in the state seat of Pittwater?
I'm very happy with the job I'm doing right now. Climate200 is the best job I've ever had in my life, and the contribution I'm making I feel like is significant, so I'm very happy where I am.
From the Canberra Times, Dan Jervis-Barty.
I'll just ask the question because Tim clearly wants it. Do you want to be the Prime Minister?
I have another go there.
Just from your perspective, what do you think was the biggest single strategic mistake that the Liberals, who were vanquished by Teal independents, made over the course of the campaign and the months beforehand? Was it the way that they described the candidates that were backed by your group as fake? Was it their use of social media? Was it the tone of their language, a sense of negativity? What do you think? Can you identify a single biggest mistake that they made?
They stopped listening. They stopped listening to their communities, and we could see it. And this is the thing that was very confusing to us. You had Liberal MPs out there saying, my community doesn't really care about climate. They don't really care about integrity. They don't really care about gender equity. And we were doing the polling and we could see that was untrue. And so they deluded themselves for whatever reason that their communities didn't care about these stuff. And the communities absolutely cared about. The most important voting issue in all of these electorates on election day was climate change.
And our last question is from the Australian newspaper. Jess Malcolm.
Jess Malcolm from the Australian newspaper. You mentioned that Climate200 has made huge inroads in regional seats, including like Cowper and Wannon, and 1/3 of your donors are actually from regional and rural Australia. Will Climate200 heavily target national seats at the next election?
Again, we don't target seats. We don't pick candidates. We don't start campaigns. It's all down to the community. So if the communities in these seats, and in this case, rural regional areas, are dissatisfied with the representation that's been given to them from their elected representatives, then they may well stand up. They may well start organising. They may well start talking to their friends, their family, their peers. They may start door knocking. They may start calling them on the phone.
Well, I guess... Sorry to interrupt. Just considering that your donors, 1/3 of them are actually from these regional seats, do you expect that it could be likely that there would be, Climate200 candidates popping up in national seats in the next election?
Again, not Climate200 candidates, community candidates. The fact that we had 1/3 of our donors from rural and regional areas sent a very strong signal to us that there was lots of support for what we were doing in the regions. And that's why we made sure that when strong community campaigns emerged in places like Cowper, in Wannon, in Calare, in Page, that we were there to support those community campaigns and the incredible community leaders that they put forward. Going in the future, if the community mobilises again, we would be very happy to be there to support those candidates next time around.
Great, thank you.
We have asked the other campaign directors to join us here at the National Press Club. Will you please thank Byron Fay for joining us here today? You get the gift of membership. Now, you don't have to be a journalist to be a member of the National Press Club. We warmly accept campaign directors and executive directors. So your gift of membership here, and we hope to see you again.
Thank you very much.
Back at the National Press Club. Byron
Much
Fay,
appreciated. Thank you.
Thank you.